who's your opposition on that sort of common sense legislation?
The first compact bill that I sponsored was for nurses. And surprisingly, even while the nurses loved it, the Ohio Nurses Association opposed it in the first General Assembly, and they blocked it. It was a union. But after I think enough of their members clamored and said, hey, we want this. After a while, they became interested parties and then eventually became proponents. And once the nurses union came on board and we passed the nursing compact, then every other profession has been coming forward saying, we want one for our members, we want one. And after that, there's been no opposition. These bills are flying through the Ohio General Assembly. And it's been great, like I said, for the professionals and for the patients because it increases access to care.
Americans are capable of achieving extraordinary things when they have the freedom and opportunity to do so. This is American Potential.
Welcome to the American Potential Podcast. I'm your host, David Fromm. DOGE is getting a lot of attention right now, and it makes sense. A lot of Americans are fed up with out-of-control federal spending, and DOGE taps right into that frustration. But there's another part that doesn't get talked about as much: regulations. DOGE isn't just about cutting spending. It's also about trimming back the mountain of red tape that affects Americans just as much as overspending does. Some states realize this impact, and they've started rolling out their own DOGE-style reforms. In fact, in one state, Ohio, a state senator started cuts to regulation before DOGE was even a thing. She saw just how overregulated her state had become and worked on getting legislation passed to reduce it. I want to welcome to the podcast the sponsor of the bill, Ohio State Senator Christina Roegner, to talk about the bill and how reducing regulations in the state has been going. Welcome, Senator. How are you?
I'm doing well, David. Thank you so much for having me on today.
Great. Well, I'm super excited to talk about this. It's such an important issue at the state level and at the federal level. Sometimes we start with a fun fact, though. And I wanted to I wanted to ask you about something. My understanding is that November 8th, 2005 is a big date for you and your family because a few big things happened. What were they?
Yes, I will never forget November 8th, 2005, because that was the day that I was first elected to Hudson City Council. My first time I was elected to office, period. But more importantly, it was the day I gave birth to my third daughter, Christine Roegner. So she was born on election day. She was born very early, like in the wee hours of the morning. And I remember after she was delivered, my husband said, "Is there anything I can do for you, honey?" I'm like, "Yes, go home and vote." So he did. He went home and voted, and we won that election. It was a close one, too, like all of my elections have been. But it started me down this journey of making a difference in people's lives. And it's really, truly been a joy.
That's fabulous. I mean, it's a lot of new stuff on one day.
It sure was.
Yeah, and so just a little bit on your background. My understanding is that you served at the local level and then as a state rep and as a state senator. I mean, how's that? What brought you to public service in the first place?
That's an excellent question because originally I just like math and science. I was a mechanical engineer. I got my MBA in finance from the Wharton School of Business, worked at McKinsey as a consultant. I really never thought that I would go into politics. But what happened was my father, who is a strong fiscal conservative like I am, he was retired from his corporate career, and he was sitting at home one day and complaining about how much government just wasted taxpayer dollars. And my mom said, "Well, get off the couch, do something about it." And so he ran for Hudson City Council. And then I started to really pay attention to really every vote on Hudson City Council. And whenever there was a 6-1 vote, I knew that one was going to be my dad. And I knew it had to do with wasting taxpayer dollars. So I was like, poor dad is so outnumbered. So I was at home with the kids at the time, and I was like, I'll throw my hat in the ring too. So I did, as well as 3 other fiscal conservatives. And it was a really interesting election because we swept out all the incumbents. We ended up making my father city council president, and we got to work saving taxpayer dollars. I mean, we cut almost 20% from Hudson's budget through attrition primarily. And that was really good because then when the recession hit in 2008, Hudson was in a great position to weather the storm. And I realized at that point just how impactful the work can be when you're in elected office and how meaningful it is. It doesn't pay anything at the time. I think it was like $10 a month or something we were getting for Hudson City Council, but the work was fun and it made a difference and I loved it. So I ran for re-election on Hudson City Council, was reelected, and then so I was on council for 5 years when I was elected to be in the Ohio House of Representatives, and then you can have even more impact. And so it's been great. It's really been a fun journey.
That's great. I'm interested in, soon we'll turn to talking about regulations and the work that you've done there. But I'm wondering, as a fiscal conservative, someone who's tackled regulations, none of those are sexy issues per se in the political sphere all the time. But I'm wondering if like your experience as an engineer, as a consultant for McKinsey, do you think that prepared you for this type of work and kind of addressing these issues?
Well, it did in many ways because, being an engineer and my background in finance, it's all about the numbers, right? And so when I saw the study from the Mercatus Center, George Mason University, about the number of regulations, they'd done a study state by state, comparing Ohio. Well, they compared all the states in the country. And then I saw that Ohio, we were tied for third worst in the nation. I wrote the numbers down here. We have California at the time. They had 396,000 regulations. New York had 296, and Ohio and Illinois were tied at 247,000. So I was like, oh my goodness, this is awful. So we got to do something about this because government, Ohio, each state is like a stage, and Ohio, the government can help set that stage, and that's taxes, it's regulations. And you're right, it's not sexy stuff, but it's important because you want to make your state as attractive as possible to CEOs as they're considering where they're going to move their businesses. So when, as an engineer, I'm looking at these numbers, I'm like, we got to do something about it. So that was a genesis of Senate Bill 9.
That's great. So the Mercatus study, was that the impetus that helped you realize that the regulation problem?
Yeah, it was. I mean, you knew more subjectively that it was an issue because I would hear from constituents and I'd hear from businesses occasionally that they'd come forward and say that, these rules and regulations don't make sense. One example I can give you was I had a gentleman come to me who sold boilers. And at the time he said, there is a old law in Ohio, I mean, from back before the Titanic sailed, that said if you have a boiler that's more than a certain number of square feet, that you have to have a full-time boiler operator babysitting it, basically. They're 24/7. And because technology has improved so much, you don't really need those operators anymore because they're safe now. But what had happened in the industry was that they had been building, and I don't recall exactly the size, but let's say it was 400 square feet, what's the limit? So in the industry in Ohio, they'd come up with a boiler that was just under that. So there's 395 square feet. So just under the limit. And hospitals that would need a certain amount of boiler capacity or businesses that need this larger boiler capacity, instead of getting the big boiler that they need, because they didn't want to pay someone to babysit it, because that was the Ohio law at the time, they would get a whole bunch of smaller ones and put them up in series. And those were actually called Ohio Specials because it was designed to get around this archaic regulation in Ohio. So, I mean, companies were morphing and twisting to try to get around these archaic rules that just didn't make sense anymore. So that was just an example of one that came to me years before we introduced Senate Bill 9. So yes, subjectively, I'd been hearing about it, and subjectively, we've been trying to do something about it, but we hadn't really realized the extent of the problem until this Mercatus Center came forward with that study I mentioned to you, where Ohio and Illinois were tied for third worst. I mean, right behind California and New York. And that is not the company we want to be keeping when it comes to setting the stage for business.
Yeah, Senator, I don't know if you know, but I actually live in Illinois, outside the Chicago area, and that is dubious company. You do not want to be lumped in with the state of Illinois, and certainly not New York and California when it comes to regulation.
Well, we would love to welcome you to come to Ohio if you want to ever move here.
Ohio is lovely. I love it. I think it's underestimated even. Well, so talk to me about the bill that you worked on in 2022. What did it do? And, what are the guts of the bill really?
So I would say if you boil it down, there's really three big components to it. One was a 30% reduction over 3 years. So we were going to do 10% a year in terms of reducing the number of regulations that we have in Ohio. That's number one. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a second. Number two was until we get to that 30%, until we reach that goal, for any single rule that an agency would introduce, they need to eliminate two. So for every one in, it would be two out to help us get to that 30% reduction. The third big thing we did was it was something very practical, and that was create a website called cutredtape.ohio.gov. And that is a simple website where they can go in if they happen to know the number of the rule. That's great. Put it in. If they don't know the rule, that's fine. Just describe it and your contact information, and that goes right to our joint agency on rule review. And so they look at these and they study them and they get them out. If they don't make sense, they change them if it needs to be changed. So those are the three big things that Senate Bill 9 did. In terms of the 30% reduction in the bill, we also say, take a look at neighboring states, see what they do, look at what best practice is, see if there's any duplicative rules or regulations, see if there's any duplication in terms of two different agencies or three agencies sort of regulating and policing the same thing. Again, there's duplication. So there were a lot of things that we suggested that these agencies look at when they're trying to get to that 30% reduction. And by the way, a 30% reduction doesn't make us the number one state in the nation. It really gets us to be middle of the pack. So we thought this is a really fair start. Let's just not be the worst anymore. Let's get to middle of the pack. But we're not going to be happy there. I guess once we can achieve this 30% reduction, then we're going to take a step back and look and say, okay, now how do we get to be number one? So that'll be like in the next year or so, in the future as we look ahead.
That's fabulous. I mean, man, that really can unleash a lot of growth. I would think. Have you guys hit the goal of the 30% reduction by this month? Right.
So we will. My office, in anticipation of this podcast, I said, let's send an email to JCAR and find out from them how it's going. Because in my role as a senator, I'm not keeping count of all the rules and regulations, but they are. So the answer came back saying 13, about half of the agencies have already met their goal, and the director is confident that by year's end we will have fully met the goal. So it's well on track to being there. So I was very happy to get the email. And then also I spoke with Senator Teresa Gavarone, who is the chair of JCAR. And I talked to her this morning, also in anticipation of this podcast. And she said specifically she loves the website. The website is working. In fact, she goes, when it went live in 2022, I believe, she said the first one to get on was a farmer from Fulton County, from her Senate district. And he was able to talk about a rule or regulation that didn't make sense for farmers, and they were able to get that fixed. So she is delighted with the results. So we're very optimistic that it will have been a success.
Yeah, I think the website's really genius because it's really empowering, bottom-up solutions. Folks who are being affected every day, especially I'd imagine small business folks, they probably bang their head against the wall in some of these things. And then so to surface those kind of with the best local knowledge to bring it to your all's attention makes a ton of sense. Where'd that idea come from? And it seems like it's been a success.
Oh, yeah. No, absolutely. So it's cutredtape.ohio.gov. So if anyone listening has a rule or regulation or even wants to see what it's like, maybe even model it in other states, it has been a tremendous success. It's super easy to use. Like I mentioned, businesses, individuals, farmers, people are using it. So yeah, it has been a success. Absolutely. And it's been helping. I don't exactly know the numbers in terms of how has come through the website versus come through the agencies themselves. But those two pulling together are going to help us meet our goal of a 30% reduction. So yeah, I would encourage other states to take a look at it if they don't have something like this and use it. But yeah, it's super easy, very user-friendly.
Yeah, I think it's great. I think it shows a lot of respect for constituents and taxpayers. It's like, hey, you guys might have better knowledge than we have it sometimes. So let's hear it.
Oh, yeah.
That's great.
Yeah. Well, it's like that example I gave you of the boilers. I mean, I never would have uncovered this archaic, law until someone who's in the industry who lives and breathes this comes forward and says, hey, this was written before the Titanic sailed, help us with it. So yeah, there's a lot of that out there. Yeah. Oh, in fact, I should mention the Ohio Administrative Code. That's where we house all our rules and regulations. Another so that contained at the time 15 million words. And so we did sort of a back of the envelope calculation that if you can read 300 words a minute and you're reading for 40 hours a week, it is going to take you 21 weeks just to read through the Ohio Revised Code. And that was another sort of data point where we're like, wow, we have a problem. We need, and combine that with the 274,000 regulations. And that's just Ohio. So if someone wants to start a business and they read through all that, and then on top of that, there's over 1 million federal restrictions. I mean, that's a lot of red tape. That's a lot of bureaucracy. It is like sludge in our economic engine. And it's no wonder people will hesitate to start a business. So that's why we want to cut through all that. We want to be business friendly because that's what's going to drive our economy.
So is there any regulation that you've heard about that stands out as maybe one of the worst or most egregious regulations?
Well, I think the one that's on top of mind again is that boiler example I gave you, where you shouldn't have to pay someone to stand by a boiler that's perfectly safe 24/7. That's expensive and it's unnecessary. And so that was one that was particularly egregious that comes to mind for me.
What do you look, as you look in the future for Ohio, what else are you and your colleagues thinking about doing or pursuing to keep reducing regulations?
Well, we're doing a lot to set the stage, including taxation. I'm hopeful that Ohio will get to a flat income tax here through this budget cycle, and then shortly thereafter to a 0% income tax. I think that would be a great goal to achieve. But in terms of regulations, something that I'm also I'm known for in the General Assembly is occupational licensure, because there's something called licensure compacts, and that's something that I've been driving. So the best way to explain that is imagine, you get your driver's license, and how, for me, I get it in Ohio, and if I wanted to drive to visit my friends in Florida, I imagine if I had to get another license in Kentucky, and then another license in Tennessee, and then Georgia, and then Florida, how cumbersome and ridiculous that sounds to you and me, right? Because once you learn how to drive a car, you know how to drive a car in all the states. The same is true and should be true for these occupational licenses. You're a nurse in Ohio. You'd also know how to be a nurse in Tennessee and in Kentucky and frankly in all the states in our country. So, but the way it was is your license didn't used to travel with you. You had to get relicensed and go through all this bureaucratic red tape and pay fees and tests, etc., to be able to practice what you already know in other states. So there's a trend in this nation being driven by the council of state governments, and funded, frankly, by the Department of Defense to form these compacts or agreements. And so that if your state passes legislation and it's profession specific, that then your professionals in that profession can travel across state lines seamlessly. It's a beautiful thing. It's taking down these artificial government barriers. So I have personally sponsored, I want to say about 13 of these. Occupational therapists was one, physical therapists, doctors, nurses, counselors, social workers, dietitians, dentists, and on and on. And so these professionals are super excited by this because now they can travel and they're not regulated, they're not restricted by red tape, right? So that's something else that I've really personally been driving here in Ohio, and professionals love it. And so do the patients.
Yeah, what a commonsensical approach. Well, I love your analogy to driver's licenses, because it makes all the sense in the world when you put it that way. It's like, yeah, why wouldn't you be able to, style hair in one place and the other? So who's your opposition on that sort of common sense legislation?
Well, frankly, so that's a great question. The first compact bill that I sponsored was for nurses. And surprisingly, even while the nurses loved it, the Ohio Nurses Association opposed it in the first General Assembly, and they blocked it. It was a union. But after I think enough of their members clamored and said, hey, we want this. After a while, they became interested parties and then eventually became proponents. And once the nurses union came on board and we passed the nursing compact, then every other profession that has been coming forward saying, we want one for our members, we want one. And after that, there's been no opposition. These bills are flying through the Ohio General Assembly. And it's been great, like I said, for the professionals and for the patients, because it increases access to care. Say your favorite physical therapist is in Florida. That person can come to Ohio in the summers, or you can do telemedicine more seamlessly too. So it helps everybody. Just makes sense.
That's fabulous. Well, I really appreciate the leadership that you've been providing in Ohio. Things that happen in bigger states sometimes have a more dramatic effect across the country. We want to see great policy everywhere, but when something happens in Ohio, a state the size and importance of Ohio, I think it reverberates. So I'm pretty thrilled for how you've been tackling regulation and trying to empower Ohioans to, start businesses and have a better life. I think it's fabulous.
It's a lot of fun. I enjoy the work, and I really love it when, I was knocking on someone's door. It was like 2 years ago, and I didn't know the person, and she was pulling up the driveway, and I could tell she was exhausted. And first introduced myself. She's like, "Oh, hi," and I saw she had a nursing badge. I'm like, "Oh, are you a nurse?" And she said, "Yes, I am." I said, "Oh, I'm Christina Roegner. I sponsored that nursing compact." And all of a sudden her eyes lit up, and she jumped up and down, and she ran over and gave me a hug. And she's like, "Thank you, thank you, thank you." She said, "My sister is also a nurse, lives in this other state." I think she said Missouri. And she goes, and now she can move back to Ohio because now she can practice nursing here. So she was so excited to have her sister come back home to Ohio. So it matters. It matters to people.
Yeah, it's so cool to see how that real world personal impact that you can have. That's fabulous. Well, Senator Roegner, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate the work that you're doing. So, keep up the great work.
Thank you so much, David. It was a pleasure talking with you.
Well, folks, hey, cutting back on regulations, both at the state and federal level, is really important, because it shouldn't be so complicated that businesses have to hire someone just to keep up with it. And, actually, we've talked to a few business owners who've said they've actually had to do just that, hiring extra people just to keep up with regulations. So we got to get away from that. If you liked this episode and would like to stay connected with the podcast, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel, as well as following us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. And always remember, liberty and freedom are easily taken for granted. Don't take it for granted. Go out there and defend freedom and liberty. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Thank you for listening to American Potential. You may listen to more stories from Americans working every day to expand freedom and opportunity in their communities by visiting AmericanPotential.com.